Welcome back to the Gentleman's Gazette. In today's video, we'll determine whether or not the current offerings from prestigious Italian hat maker Borsalino are worth your money or not. Today's video is another installment in our ongoing Is It Worth It series, where we take a look at high-profile men's brands and determine whether their products are actually worth your hard-earned money. For our full Is It Worth It playlist, you can go here. Dress hats have certainly had their ups and downs over the past several decades in menswear, going from something that would be worn by most men most every day to something that's only worn today by true menswear enthusiasts. And while there are several smaller brands that still hold a prestigious reputation today, including Dobbs, Akubra, and Optimo, perhaps the two biggest names in hats today are companies whose history goes back over a century: Stetson and Borsalino. The hats of both of these brands used to be worn by many stylish men, and Borsalino in particular counted men like Humphrey Bogart, Ernest Hemingway, Al Capone, Michael Jackson, and David Bowie among its wearers. And while hats occupy more of a niche market today, there are still notable wearers of Borsalino hats these days, including Johnny Depp, Brad Pitt, Leonardo DiCaprio, and James Spader, who have all been seen wearing them on occasion. However, even the mightiest in the dress hat market have struggled to maintain their once massive influence, and in fact, Borsalino declared bankruptcy in 2017. After rebounding and rebranding somewhat, Borsalino does still exist today, and they carry several offerings, both those that are more classically styled and those that are more fashion-forward. Most of their hats are priced well into the $200 range today, with some even being above $500. Keeping those relatively high prices in mind then, today's video will determine whether or not Borsalino still produces a quality product with good materials and construction, or whether you're better off leaving their hats behind. Before getting into specific offerings, however, we should take a look at what made Borsalino the hat company it is today, so let's examine their history. Based out of Alessandria, Piedmont, the brand is the oldest Italian hat maker that is still in business today. The company's co-founder and namesake, Giuseppe Borsalino, learned his trade in France before moving back home to start his own hat company. Giuseppe and his brother Lazzaro Borsalino founded Borsalino Giuseppe e Fratello in 1857, and Giuseppe died in 1900, leaving Teresio Borsalino to take over the company. Interestingly enough, however, round about 1905 or 1906, cousin Gianbattista Borsalino raised money and founded his own Borsalino Hat Company. So, up until the year 1936, there were actually two hat companies bearing the Borsalino name. The original company, founded by Giuseppe, grew over the 1800s, and in 1888, it moved into a state-of-the-art factory in Corso Cento Canoni, Alessandria. While the company no longer operates out of this factory, the building currently houses the Borsalino Museum, and you can see the original machines that made the hats. In 1900, Giuseppe's company won the Grand Prix, which was the most prestigious award for hat makers at the time. Business became increasingly harder for both Borsalino hat companies during the Great Depression, at which point they merged together into one company. The business was family-owned until the mid-1980s and has changed hands multiple times since then. In the opinion of hat expert and friend of the channel Steve Heck, more on him later in the video, the quality of felt that Borsalino used in its hats actually improved around the time period of World War II and shortly thereafter. They started to introduce more specialty finishes around this time and were able to source better fur, given that natively Italy doesn't have a great source of fur for felt hats. Meanwhile, the hat components pre-World War II, including the sweatbands and liners, were of very high quality, especially for the export market. Up until the First World War, the brand was at something of a peak, employing over 2,500 employees and producing up to 2 million hats annually. Perhaps their biggest moment of publicity came in the classic film Casablanca, where both Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman were wearing Borsalino hats in the film's famous closing scene. There's also a film from 1970 simply called Borsalino that prominently shows off many of their hats. Slightly before that, though, and dating to the mid-1950s, culture shifts precipitated a decline in hat wearing from many men, and the company had to downsize a bit. They relocated to a factory in Spinetta, Marengo, out of which they still operate today. As mentioned before, the company was purchased in the 1980s from Vittorio Vaccarino, the last surviving member of the Borsalino family, and has changed hands multiple times through the 80s, 90s, and today. The quality of Borsalino's hats was consistently very high up until the early 1980s, when the family sold the business and the original factory closed. Since then, the quality of their hats has varied somewhat, especially considering the high price point. The company had its worst period in 2017, the year of its 160th anniversary, when, as mentioned before, it declared bankruptcy. It was sold at auction to the private equity firm Aeres Equita, who still own it today. They've promised to keep the current factory in Alessandria and follow the over 50-step process involved in making the hats. With these many production steps, it can take up to 7 weeks to produce a felt hat and up to 6 months to produce a straw model. Again mentioning Steve Heck, he visited the Borsalino factory in January of 2016, and you're currently seeing images from that visit and tour. Here are a few of his observations. Most of the machinery found at the current factory was moved from the original factory when the company was sold in the 1980s, and the front end of the felt production process dates back to around the beginning of the 20th century. While there are still many steps involved in producing Borsalino's hats, they have actually cut down on the number of individual steps in recent years for cost-saving measures. Borsalino now sources their processed fur from Portugal and occasionally from Belgium. And in a potentially positive sign, Borsalino has recently returned to producing their own straw hats after outsourcing previously to other companies like Tesi. During Steve's tour, Borsalino representatives were very open to answering questions and showing off many stages of the process, so they're certainly transparent about the product they make. But with history out of the way, let's now turn to construction methods and what to look for in a quality hat. By the way, for a bit of background, you can check out our Fedora guide here, and our video on hat terminology here to better understand all of the different components of a classic men's hat. Of course, the first thing to consider when looking at a fedora is the felt or straw sourced for its construction. In other words, material is the most important component of a quality hat, as different fibers will hold up better against the elements than others will. Synthetic materials and canvas would be the cheapest, and these are the types of hats usually associated with the infamous neck beards. Following up from this, you'll find hats made from wool felt, then rabbit fur felt, and finally beaver fur felt, which is of the highest quality. The reason beaver is the most coveted material is because their fur is highly water resistant, allowing a hat made from beaver fur felt to resist multiple possible downpours over the course of its wearable lifetime. After all, when a hat is subjected to too much moisture, it can lose its shape and become unattractive, at which point it needs to be reblocked. On that subject, hatters are rare these days, so if you'd like to learn how to reblock your own felt hats at home, you can take a look at this video here. Most quality hats today will be made from rabbit fur felt, commonly sourced from Australia and different parts of Europe, as different rabbits have become invasive species in this part of the world and thus are in large supply. Also, the beaver population worldwide has begun to recover somewhat from near extinction, meaning that beaver fur can also be ethically sourced these days as well. While most rabbit fur felt is still of good quality and can certainly take a beating, it isn't quite as water resistant as beaver fur felt is. The length of the hair fibers will also help to determine how durable a hat is in the long term. And a quality hat can last a lifetime without ever developing any holes in the felt. The dye finishing process also plays a big role, as lesser quality dyes can bleed out of a hat when exposed to water. Turning for a moment to straw hats like Panamas, the quality of these is determined mainly by how tight and dense the weave of the straw will be. The finest straw hats, then, are carefully woven by hand from Ecuadorian Montecristi straw. And of course, to learn more about Panama hats, you can check out our video on that subject here. Borsalino hats today seem to be most commonly made from rabbit fur felt, and they don't always list the materials used even on some of their most expensive listings. The felt used today is also made from shorter fibers and is more lightweight than vintage counterparts, so these hats may be slightly less durable over time. Older methods of production, such as using chemicals like mercury to more tightly bond the felted fibers together, made vintage hats more durable. But processes like these were outlawed in the 1940s and 50s, as the chemicals used were extremely harmful to the hatters making the hats. Prolonged exposure to chemicals like mercury could lead to negative psychological effects, and indeed, this is where the phrase "mad as a hatter" originally comes from. While unfortunate, this older process does mean that vintage models will often be sturdier than the models made today. Another hallmark to check on when it comes to classic men's hats is the quality of the leather used for the sweatband. This, of course, will play a large role in the comfort of the hat, as the sweatband is the part that will be making direct contact with your head, and a quality hat won't skip out on using quality leather. Most of Borsalino's felt hats today do still have leather sweatbands, though some of their straw models will have fabric sweatbands. This is fairly common, though, as fabric will better absorb sweat, and of course, straw hats are typically worn in summer when the weather is hotter. You can also check the stitch density and quality at the brim welt and look at the edge of the brim to see if the hat is of good quality. Another main point to consider, aside from construction materials, is the styling of hats offered. Most hats from the golden age of menswear had an open crown that could then be bashed into any shape that the wearer desired, including shapes like the teardrop, diamond crown, or center dent. The width of the brim would often fall somewhere between 2 1/4 and 3 inches, and crowns would be of similar heights to harmonize well with the brim. Borsalino hats available today are often a bit more modern in their styling, however, with a crown that is more tapered at the top and brims that are a bit less wide, often around 2 inches. There are exceptions, though, with models like the Bogart and Alessandria, and we'll be profiling a few particular models shortly later on in the video. Keep in mind, though, that a brim of 2 inches is about as narrow as you'll want to go while still maintaining the practical benefit of protection of your eyes from sunlight. Depending on your own personal tastes and goals for wearing a hat, then, it can be seen as either a positive or a negative that Borsalino has embraced some of the more modern trends in their hat styling. Some of their current product lines, like Street, Arts and Crafts, and Glamour, have even embraced such trends as bold logoing all across the hat. And even their more classically styled hats can't avoid some logo stamping today. With that in mind, then, we ordered 2 new hats from Borsalino to examine for today's video, and both were made in Italy. The first is the Francesco fur felt fedora in charcoal gray, which I'm wearing here. According to the Borsalino website, Francesco is a soft-feeling fur felt hat with a smaller brim and a more tapered crown. The brim measures 1 7/8 inches and is finished with a plain edge. The tapered crown measures 4 inches at the front. The Francesco has a full satin lining, a leather interior sweatband, and a grosgrain hatband, and the Borsalino name is discreetly embossed in gold on the bow of the hatband. Your mileage may vary with how discreet you actually believe this to be, however. Fedoras with slightly narrower brims like these are commonly associated today with figures like Frank Sinatra, and as such, this is why Borsalino chose to call this model Francesco. The other model we ordered today is simply called the beaver fur felt hat with a medium brim in dark brown. According to Borsalino, this hat is made from 100% beaver fur felt and features a 2 1/2 inch brim, 4 1/2 inch center dent crown, grosgrain hatband, leather sweatband, and interior lining, and is, according to Borsalino, one of the finest fedoras that they currently offer. Both of these hats are in a size 56, or in other words, a size 7 in the US or 6 7/8 in the UK. While different online retailers may differ in how they give sale prices, the full retail price of the Francesco is $390 US, and the full price of the beaver fur felt hat is $710 US. Both fit my head relatively well, so fit-wise, we'd call them true to size. And, as mentioned, both feature a plain or raw edge to their brim rather than being trimmed in fabric or sewn. While this look is fairly typical among modern hats and even some vintage hats, and is perfectly unassuming, I personally find it to look a bit rustic or unfinished in appearance because, after all, it is unfinished. Conversely, the vintage fedoras in my own collection feature a subtle Kavanaugh edge, which refers to a style of hand felting on the brim that is no longer offered on modern hats. I'm accustomed to this small detail, and to me it makes a hat brim feel slightly more complete, but this is a minor concern overall. Both hats have grosgrain ribbons, black on the charcoal hat and brown on the dark brown hat, and as mentioned, Borsalino is stamped onto the bow. While it is relatively subtle, at least compared to some of their other product lines, it's still a bit flashy for my personal taste overall. The beaver fur hat also features a wind cord, which is a somewhat obscure vintage detail. The small button can be inserted through a jacket's lapel buttonhole, so if things are too windy, the hat won't get too far from the wearer if it's blown off. And while we didn't field test the wind cord on this hat, I do give Borsalino style points for the wind cord's inclusion. Overall, the workmanship on both hats is solid. The stitching is even and tidy with no obvious defects. The lining and leather also seem to be of good quality, and the felt strikes a good balance between softness and durability. One detail I'm not too fond of is the somewhat visible exterior stitching of the hat band to the crown, though again, this is subtle. As far as general appearance goes, I personally don't think that either style suits me terribly well, although the Francesco style is a bit more to my liking. Still, the crowns taper a bit more than I'm personally used to, and the beaver fur hat has a brim that is too wide for me. Of course, these appearance critiques are ultimately just subjective, as someone with a different face shape might look better in either or both of these styles. By the way, for our video on how to find the right hat for your face shape, you can go here. Again, being historically minded, we also wondered, how do the Borsalino hats of today compare to those of yesteryear? We mentioned friend of the channel Steve Heck earlier on in the video, and in fact, he sent us a number of vintage Borsalino hats to take a look at. As an aside here, he also sent us some of the vintage bowler hats you can see in our video on that hat style. You can find Steve's website, from which we also sourced some of our historical information, in the video description, and a big thanks to Steve. Looking at the vintage hats, which included fedoras, Homburgs, and a trilby, it is clear that a slightly higher quality degree of workmanship went into the construction of these hats. For example, you can take note of the higher stitch density on the interior sweatband and the lack of visible stitching on the exterior hatband. The dark brown trilby in particular, which Steve believes dates to the late 1930s, fits and suits me best, although again, this is somewhat subjective in the looks department. Also, while most of the hats, aside from the Homburgs, are still soft and supple, they do feel slightly more durable in their construction, though this may be due to some of the older techniques we outlined earlier. Overall, then, the difference in quality between the vintage Borsalino hats and the modern ones isn't large, but it is still apparent to somebody who's really looking at the fine details. With all that said, then, let's get to the main question of today's video. Are Borsalino hats worth it or not? Borsalino does indeed still make a quality product, though not quite to the same high standard that it once had at earlier points in its history. Some of the design choices of their current models are a bit odd, but there are of course still more classic offerings available. And like other storied menswear companies such as Allen Edmonds, observant buyers have noted a slight increase in quality control issues in recent years and decades, though your mileage may vary with this. Of course, $200 to $500 for many men will simply be a lot to drop on a hat. Indeed, at this price point, many bespoke hatters could make you a beaver fur or beaver blend hat to your own specifications and with your individual head shape in mind. While the price point will still be high in these circumstances, if you do actually visit a hatter in person, you'll be able to try on different products and get the fit exact. We would call Borsalino a safe brand to explore, however, if you're new to hats and not ready to commit to a bespoke process. Borsalino also does offer many different colors of hats, including things as wild as electric blue, maroon, or white for the more fashion-forward, should this be a desire of yours. Still, vintage Borsalinos will offer the highest degree of quality from the brand. Keep in mind, though, that men of the past did have slightly smaller heads overall, so vintage hats you can find today will typically be in sizes of 7 1/4 and smaller. While our heads have gotten bigger these days, it's debatable whether or not we've actually gotten any smarter. Ultimately then, answering the question of whether a Borsalino hat is worth it comes down to your own personal criteria. If money is no object for you and you don't mind paying full price, what you'll be getting is indeed a quality product. But at the same time, as we already mentioned, you could spend a comparable amount on a custom hat if you know where to look. And if the sticker price of these Borsalino hats is too high for you, and for me personally it certainly is, then you may want to look for vintage hats instead. And indeed, the slightly higher construction quality of vintage hats may be of interest to you as well. The hats in my own personal collection, for instance, most of which are Dobbs brand if you're curious, have served me well for years already, have mostly minimal wear and tear, and cost me under $50 each. So, whatever route you choose, just be sure to pace yourself and consider all your options, taking in mind the advice we laid out in today's video and elsewhere. In today's video, I'm wearing a relatively subtle monochromatic look in grayscale based around my Borsalino hat. Again, the one I'm wearing is the Francesco fur felt fedora in charcoal gray. To harmonize with the color of the hat, I'm wearing a charcoal gray suit, this time in a 2-piece configuration, although it is originally a 3-piece, which features a very subtle bit of texture and pattern to its weave. I'm also wearing a plain white dress shirt with French cuffs, into which I've got our platinum-plated sterling silver monkey's fist knot cufflinks from Fort Belvedere inserted. Other Fort Belvedere accessories include my boutonniere, which is a prototype design in white, my pocket square, which is in gray flannel and features a hand-rolled white X stitch, and my Prince of Wales patterned tie in black and white. Also from Fort Belvedere are my socks, which are in charcoal gray and feature clock patterns in light gray and black. I'm wearing these to harmonize with my suit, as well as with my shoes, which are cap-toed black Oxfords from Carmina. Aside from the prototype boutonniere, you can find all of the Fort Belvedere accessories I'm wearing in today's video, as well as a wide array of other classic men's accessories in the Fort Belvedere shop here.